No longer searching for a steady breeze. There is soil on my skin and salt water in my blood. A descendant of God, I feel as if I am sunshine with a pulse. I bear my fertile flower from which humanity originates. Rivers of milk flow from me, and I watch as entire kingdoms bow. All the children are here, barefoot in the morning.
We really may not serve ourselves so well when we appear to come directly at a problem such as special ed. You see, because sometimes when you come so directly at it, you omit looking at the context of the problem. And we also have to watch the tendency due to our being here in this system to focus so exclusively on one issue that we ignore other very important issues. This system, for instance, tries to get us to talk about problems that confront us as people and not consider the political, economic context in which these problems are generated. And often, though we are well-meaning, when we do this, we end up not solving the problems. So I'll beg your indulgence because I'm going to talk a bit about some things that may appear not to be directly related to special ed, but I think you will realize that they are. I want to start off by indicating that for the African in America, whether it's slave or as so-called freedman, has always been subjected to a special education. And this is the thing that we have to recognize. We have to forget that this thing called special education is something special. There's nothing special about special education. Black people have been specially educated from day one. We've always been the subjects of a special education. So this thing that you call special education is special education within special education. It's just a subclass of the general special education to which we have been subjected as a people and to which we are now subjected as a people. This is no less the case as being subjected to a special education today as it was in 1619 when we first set foot on this planet. And for the same essential reasons. That is, we're specially educated in this system for essentially the same reasons in 1993 as we were in 1619. I have told you often that there are certain things that remain constant despite all obvious changes. And it is very important that we as a people recognize the constants and not be deceived by apparent changes. We must recognize when the changes are engaged in order to maintain the constants, to keep the world the same. And many times, many of us are deceived by apparent changes. And we then lose sight of what is consistent in the world. I've talked then about what I call European constants, those intentionalities of Europeans that have been present since the 15th century, as far as we are concerned, are still present right here today and are expected by Europeans to be present into the foreseeable future. And no matter what has happened, these expectations have remained consistent. And if there have been changes and drastic changes in terms of our relationships to Europeans, these constants have remained the same. And these changes have been engaged in to maintain them. Some of those constants you've heard me mention. One, of course, which is very important, which we see operating in Africa today, which we've seen operating in Panama, in Grenada, and which will operate in the future on the African continent and other places where African people are, is what we call the military differential. With Europeans who are 10% of the population, their continued dominance rests on their maintaining superior military force. In fact, to a great extent, our being over here today is the result of military differences. There is no intention for the Europeans to equalize that differential between Africans and themselves. That differential has been there since we met them, and it has really not changed up to this very moment. And we see it operating in Africa at this very moment. And there is the intention that it will continue to operate in the world. Hidden behind this intentionality are a lot of glorious looking things, such as non-proliferation treaties. The treaty that Bush just signed with Yeltsin, perpetrated in the name of peace, when it is nothing more than an intention to maintain European power by limiting the growth of military power on the part of non-European people. It has nothing to do with peace. It has to do with maintaining superiority and white supremacy in the world. So we must not be deceived by these games. To maintain the European, of course, has all intentions to maintain the economic differential. There is no intention for the Europeans to see Africans as equally, economically equal with them, no matter what the talk is about. There is every intention for the European to continue to exploit African natural and human resources, no matter in what guise, even though he may appoint African so-called leaders and support African regimes. The intention is the same as it always has been, to maintain economic advantage of African people, to maintain the technological differential. These are constants. And we saw European technology as it was used against our ancestors. The intention is that it will be used in the future as it is used now. The Europeans intend to maintain the power of definition, which we'll talk about tonight. Because special education, as we will talk about shortly, is a definition. And as I said, I think earlier today, before we get involved in a discussion of special education, we should ask, why have we permitted the Europeans to define what it is? Why do they have the power to do so, and why do we submit to their definition of our behavior as a people? So before you get caught up in the intricacies of whether tests can differentiate between the learning disabled and the non-disabled, you should ask first questions first. Who determines it? And why are they able to impose their determination on us as a people? It is through then defining the world that we will elaborate that the European manipulates the world and maintains his power in it. And therefore he intends to maintain that power of definition. He intends to maintain control of the domain of discourse. A great deal of the discussion today over the various kinds of curricula, the multicultural curriculum, the curriculum of inclusion, the African-centered curriculum, and so forth, are struggles with the European over who will define what it is important to talk about. What shall be taught and what shall not be taught. What people shall learn and not learn. What educational experience shall people undergo and not undergo? Because all of these are related to power and to power relations. And therefore, if the European is intending to maintain power and control of the world, he must seek to maintain control over the domain of discourse, to decide what is worth talking about, to decide what is news, to decide the subject matter of curricula of various types. There are other areas, the area, of course, of always making those things African secondary to those things European. These constants were there from the beginning. They are here now, and there's every intention for them to remain in the future. Despite the elevation of blacks to high-level jobs, despite, some amounts of assimilationism, and despite some multiculturalism in the schools and so forth, these intentions remain the same. And it becomes very important for you to watch the changes and how they maintain these things. Because if you are to gain power in the world, it must be these very things which must be changed, ladies and gentlemen. The education of Africans has always revolved around education for servitude. That has not changed one whit. I have warned in Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children that the main purpose of education is and unequal. And believe me, I'm not an advocate of integrated education. Education that was ultimately and is ultimately degrading to black people has not changed. It was that way from the beginning, and it's that way right now. Education that ultimately insults the history and culture of African people. Education that is Eurocentric, meaning an education that prepares black people to maintain European power as the central power in the world. Education of black people according to the white man's estimation of black intelligence and his need to shape and direct it. I've warned you before that you need to change the definition of intelligence before you get into an argument with Europeans as to whether their tests are measuring intelligence or not. You must ask, what is the political function of your definition of intelligence? What is the political economy of your definition of intelligence? And why is it that the way you define intelligence always ends up that means intelligent people work for you and your interests? So consequently then, we must recognize as an African people that the ultimate goal of intelligence must be that of preparing a people to solve their problems. The way intelligence is defined today and in America is such that if we as African people are said to behave intelligently, we are behaving in ways to perpetuate our oppression and to maintain European power over us. And therefore, it becomes important to the European to define what intelligence is and to define how it is measured. And for us to engage in futile arguments as to whether it's caused by cultural differences or genetic differences, when it really is not even the point. According to Henry Allen Bullock, author of A History of Negro Education in the South from 1619 to the present, in the beginning there was no thought of educating Negroes. Yet the necessity to do so was always present. You see, ultimately the white man is faced with a dilemma. In his heart and way, he would not like to educate us, but the very structure and demands and dynamics of his economic system in a way forces him to do so. And so even though he had no intentions, and you can see in the history books some overt statements about not educating blacks, because if you read the history of Frederick Douglass, you saw the issue there of the slave master and his reading abilities, what kind of problems they created. But in a sense, the white man's education of the African man under white supremacy has been very ambivalent, both intentional and non-intentional. Bullock goes on to say that soon after the establishment of the slave regime in the American South, there was set in motion unintentional processes destined to introduce the first of many educational opportunities that Negroes were to have prior to the Civil War. Because we must recognize that the plantation system and the slave system was what we call a rational system, in the sense that it was an organized economic system and operated according to definite goals and intentions. And another expression of rational business practice in terms of the slave system of the South appeared in the attempts of planters to utilize their labor efficiently. You see, so if you've got an economic system, whether that system is called slavery or not, ultimately you want to make it function efficiently to get the greatest bang for the buck. A complex system of division of slave labor was instituted on every plantation, and all of this was done in pursuit of maximum production per unit of slave labor. If you would read the magazines during this period, you will see great discussions as to how to maximize production on the plantation. how to relate to the slaves, how to train them, and how to motivate them so as to maximize profit. So within the broad limits of this rational system, he, the slave master, was expected to require yet absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for profitable production and survival of the slavery economy. Another constant that has not changed, has it? Not at all. For ladies and gentlemen, this is the central essence of the education of African Americans today. To maximize what? Production for Europeans, and to establish in the African body absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for whom? For Africans themselves? No, profitable for production and survival of the European economy. That's why we define ourselves in terms of our education as preparing to get jobs from Europeans. And how best to what? Qualify ourselves to fit in the European economy so that we can aid its efficiency. The laws of every slave state backed the normative line which he, the master, could draw, and every slave was expected to fear the consequences of any deviation from the range of tolerance his master set. And we shall see again these rules that determine special education still have these things in mind, because these rules are rules that determine deviancy and non-deviancy. And their purpose is to correct deviant black behavior and bring it back in line with European economic and political intentions. And to create in our children personality orientations and behavioral orientations that are supportive of those intentions. These requirements, that is, set up by the European, set a rigorous socio-cultural matrix within which young Negroes were to be socialized and were to become the personality types required by the rational order. We are going to come back in a minute to what we call the political economy of the personality and the political economy of normality, you see, because we are used to looking at normality as a psychological concept and a psychological state. No, ladies and gentlemen, normality essentially is a political and economic state, not a state of psychology. So however, we've been deceived, you see. But we'll get back to that in a minute. All the slaves could not be efficiently utilized as the rational system required unless they were trained in the ways the system by law itself prohibited. In a sense, the system broke its own laws in order to increase its efficiency. And even though it might have had laws against teaching slaves to read, slaves still were taught to read. And teaching slaves other things, slaves learned many skills and so forth. Why? And in a sense then, slaves started their education on the job in America and received on-the-job training. They also were hired out in other professions where they earned monies for their masters and bought the money back. With all due respect to Malcolm X, there were greater divisions than field hands and house servants. There were deep hierarchies of slaves with numbers of skills and so forth. The slaves not only worked in the house, or not only worked in the fields, but they worked throughout the Southern economy. They were millwrights and carpenters and blacksmiths and shipbuilders and all other kinds of things you could name. You recognize that in many areas of the South, after the emancipation, there were more skilled black laborers than there were white laborers as a result of their training on the plantations. And that is a whole nother story. And it's amusing today to see people talk about black people as unskilled, as if our lack of skills were here since we started. That was not the case. We had to be de-skilled as a people in this country. And those skills began right on the plantation. We were hired out. In a sense, then, the plantation was the first training school for African people. And to a great degree, the slave masters recognized, as they do today, that a trained slave could sell for more on the marketplace. And therefore, when you went on the auction block, the more skills you had, the more he could fetch for you. In fact, some of the skills were developed as an investment so that when the slave was sold, he would bring more than was invested in it. Sounds like today, ladies and gentlemen? Sounds like this kind of thing when we are told, we tell our children to build your marketable skills so that when you go on the auction block in front of your white employers, you can demand a higher price because you can project the skills that he has set in you. What do the French tell us? More things change, the more they remain the same. And this capacity we must maintain, or else we will be deceived by superficial changes that so many of our people are. Some of you heard me on the radio. That is leading aggression against our own people. Let's look a minute at the political economy of the personality. You see, before we talk about personality as a psychological entity, ask yourself the question, what is its political and economic function? You see, we get a lot of people get caught up about normality and abnormality and try to define what is normal and what is not normal. Before you get caught up in asking that question, ask yourself, what is the social function and the political function of normality? You see, in other words, then, the personality, to a great extent, is a political creation and a social creation. So is normality. That is why they are defined differently by different cultures. And that is why what's called normal in one may be perceived as abnormal in the other. And therefore, to a great extent, what is normal and what is abnormal are the results of the interaction of social power and social forces within a society. The personality and abnormality are the results to a great extent of the systematic use of reward and punishment on the bodies of people. Threat and intimidation, control of information, control of interaction, and so yes. Personality and normality involves a particular organization of the person's ways of thinking, the organization of a person's ways of behaving, of seeing the world, of seeing himself, of looking at the world and relating to people in that world. More deeply, it is an organization of people's tastes and interests and desires. And if you look closely at it then, normal people in a particular society will be interested in those things that maintain that society. Will have desires which, if satisfied, maintains the power relations in that society. Am I making myself clear here? Okay? They will be interested in things that maintain power relations. They will define themselves in ways that maintain power relations. The way some black men define themselves today as skirt chasers, as beer drinkers, looking at a TV set, watching men run into each other and fall down. That's a man. Keeping up and being solely obsessed by women. Solely obsessed, as we say, with playing with balls. Yes. Drinking themselves into a stupor, looking at people, running, bang into each other, and get up and run again. Not reading, not studying war, not developing economic power, not developing military power, not learning how to relate and associate with other men and women to form an organization that will be an expression of African power and to liberate African people. That somehow has been made to be perceived by many of our young men and women today has to be engaged in feminine or less than manly activities. And the society is willing to pay black males millions of dollars to maintain those interests. That's why I have told you in other contexts that man has little to do with your penis or your testicles. What is a man is a social definition. It is a political definition. The definition of what is a man must be ultimately connected to the needs of the society itself, so that a man in acting out his manhood is maintaining his social group. If man is not defined, and what it means to be a man is not defined socially and in terms of his social group, then he will not be social, but antisocial. And one of the major reasons then our males are attacking our own societies and communities today is because they have not correctly defined what it means to be a man. A normal African man would not kill another man in order to take the money he rifles from his pocket to a white man and give it to him and make him rich so that he can rule over him further. Not normality. In fact, you don't even have to go that far. A normal man, black man, doesn't work day and night only to give his money to a white man. You have to be abnormal. But of course, the white man has to make you feel that that is what? Normal. And that is the American way. And you're doing what you want to do, and nobody else can tell you how to spend your money. You are now expressing American individualism and what it means to be free. Isn't it strange? And watch it, ladies and gentlemen, every means by which the normal African American defines his freedom ends up supporting white folks. To prove that he can live anywhere he wants to, he's got to move into a white neighborhood. To prove that he's free to go to any school he wants to, he goes to a white school. To prove that he can spend his money anywhere he wants to because he's a free man, he spends it with white folks. You understand? Yeah. White man feels as free as a bird and feels no compulsion to live among you, and does not feel that his freedom is infringed upon at all. Doesn't feel any compulsion to go to school with black folk. He doesn't feel like he's unfree because he's not going to school with you. He doesn't feel as he's unfree because he's not spending money with you, because he's not laying in the bed with you, and all these other kinds of things. But the Negro, in order to feel free and express his freedom, must spend and give his money and his labor power and everything else to everyone else but himself. That establishes him as a free individual and a normal individual. So then normality, you see, ladies and gentlemen, more than a psychological function, is a political and economic function. Because as you express your normality, as you express your law-abidingness, you maintain the system. Yeah. You heard me talk about this morning. Our respect for the law. The law, as if it represents something holy and above all people. The law is nothing but a bunch of rules laid down by one gang of people who have the power to enforce it on another gang. Understand? Nothing sacred about it. And it's passed and ratified to protect group interests, one set of group interests against what? Another set of group interests. That's all it's about. Nothing sacred about it. But you see, if you see law and law-abidingness as indicative of pro-social behavior and indicative of normality, then by obeying that law and looking at law that way, you will have to do what? Maintain the people who passed the law in what? In power. It was until Martin Luther King and others decided that they would do what? Break the law. Okay? Break the law. Be what? Abnormal. That the power relations and the social relations of America began to tumble down. So you have to be careful, you see, how you define yourself. A.R. Luria argues in his book, Cognitive Development, Its Cultural and Social Foundations, and I recommend this highly to those of you who are in education, A.R. Luria, because it demonstrates so very clearly how the mentality of people are shaped very much by the type of social activities they're allowed to engage in, by the type of social and political structure they are conditioned in as people. The science of psychology has avoided the idea that many mental processes are social and historical in origin. Mental processes just don't flow from the brain as a natural effluvia. Mental processes are historical events and are related to historical experiences, or that important manifestations of human consciousness have been directly shaped by the basic practices of human activity and the actual forms of culture. We have to recognize it, and we don't have time to go into this evening. When the new publication in a few months comes out, Educating Black Children for the 21st Century, we will find in there detail what is being stated here, of how the mentality and consciousness of our people is very directly related to the experience of our people in America, and how teachers, what you call concrete thinking in African children in these schools, is directly related to the fact with white folk, we wouldn't think and behave the way we do now. No, we would act differently and behave differently. To a great extent, then, the things we talk about, the things we're interested in, the way we look at ourselves, and all of these kinds of things are a product of the nature of the power relations that have adhered between us and white folk. Imagine how you would be if we were the more powerful ones. In fact, we wouldn't be having this lecture tonight. It wouldn't even be a subject matter. We'd be talking about how we could keep it and how we could protect what? African interests. Right now, we have to talk about how we're going to take it. These relations, these power relations have and are guided by social and legal definitions and rules and their enforcement by whites. These definitions and rules provide standards and ways of judging others as deviants or non-deviants, of transforming an instance of conduct into a deviant or non-deviant act. I want you to keep in mind what I'm talking about in terms of rules, you see, and definitions, because it's what is defined as learning disabled, you see. What is defined as being in need of special education. And that definition being based on the exhibition of certain types of behavior, and then stigmatizing people based on this behavior. Even though when you get to really look at it, ladies and gentlemen, the behavior is not deviant or non-deviant. These definitions and rules serve a dual function. They provide for the labeling of others and supply the means and the authority to stigmatize the behavior of others. You will recognize as we go on then that when you permit others to label behavior, your own behavior, you are giving them a power over you. And it will be that label which will authorize them to do certain things to you and about you. So they are not just labels, but they are the justifiers of behavior. And they prescribe various behaviors toward those who are labeled. Consequently, definitions and rules are expressions of group, conflict, and interest. I want you to keep that in mind. Labels are not just labels of behavior. Labels are entered into as a part of the interaction between groups. I don't want you to do this, therefore I will make it against the law. And when you do it, I shall call you a criminal. You see? And so, what do we have here? And why am I making this law? And why am I calling you a criminal? So that I can protect what? My interests. You see, and can justify myself in treating you in a particular way so that my interests can be protected. And the formulation, this formulation of rules and definitions translate into power to impose one group's will on the other. The power to define and enforce one group's definition on the other's conduct. And this is what this is about. If you look back in your old Bible there, you will see that Adam is symbolically given the power to dominate the earth by God, by the fact that God permits him to do what? Name all the animals, the fish and the fowl, and to name the earth itself. That is a power. And this is a symbol. By saying this, he is saying, you are the one who dominates the world, because I'm going to permit you to define the world, to name it, and to relate to it in terms of the way you define it and name it. This then will give you the right to impose yourself on nature and to impose yourself on the world. Consequently, when you let another people have the right to define your behavior, you let them also have the right to impose themselves on you. And it's amazing what happens when you have definition. You talk about, some of you are familiar with the book, Regulating the Poor. It's interesting how so-called normal behavior can in an instant be turned into abnormal behavior by the mere act of labor. How, for instance, some of you may have gone to Boston, you heard something called the Common Garden, the Boston Common Gardens, a park, which harks back to a European tradition where certain lands belong to all of the people. And the peasants then had the right to hunt on those lands, Overnight, it was all right then to, if you didn't have a license, to be beaten until the blood ran. And overnight then, it became possible to talk about the personality of the beggar. And to see the beggar as having a criminal personality, no doubt built into his genes. Yeah, the same kind of game that we have today. A group of people interested in their profits and interested in maintaining power and control pass laws, and overnight then the behavior of our people suddenly become what? Criminal and abnormal. And now the same behavior that they were exhibiting before the laws were called become indicative of criminal personalities and of illness and abnormality. Let's wake up. And notice then that the labeling and defining of behavior, again, not essentially and only a psychological process, but it is a psychopolitical, psychoeconomic process. As a matter of fact, I will give you a short publication to read shortly called The Psychoeconomics of Black on Black Violence. You thought I was through with it, didn't you? Oh, I knew when I wrote the psychodynamics of Black on Black violence that wasn't all of it. No, Black on Black violence is determined more than internal psychodynamics. Because you must recognize those psychodynamics are a reflection of economic dynamics. They are the psychological reflection of economic demands of an economic system. They do not therefore begin in the psyche of African people. They begin in the very economic structure of European people. And it acts itself out through their behavior. Because the purpose of that system is to organize Black behavior, as I said earlier, to maintain itself. When all of those who may have achieved some position of leadership or influence must be perceived as totally and superly clean, and must not be perceived as having one chink of a flaw in their personality. There is no man who is unflawed. He who is without sin cast the first stone. And yet, when you demand of your leaders that they be totally saints and total saints, then all your enemy has to do is put one little smudge of dirt on them. And everything of value that they have to offer now is thrown out. And no lessons are learned. Yes, and taste, but your taste had already been dictated by the Europeans. And it had been dictated in such a way that you became gluttons for European things. And being glutton for European things, you gave them all of your money. You gave them more than you even earned. That's why you're in debt today. And in giving away and feeding your gluttonous appetites that the Europeans had inculcated in you, you had no money left to educate your children. No money left to invest in your businesses. No money left to support your families and the other social institutions. And now you wonder why your children are stabbing you in the streets and robbing you. And Elijah Muhammad then said, we will change their taste. Let them eat bean pie. Let them get a taste for this kind of clothing. Let them get an interest in this. Let them lose their taste for alcohol. Let them lose their taste for cigarettes. Let them lose their taste for junk food. Let them eat once a day. Why? Because they spend from $2,000 to $5,000 a year per person buying junk and garbage. And therefore, with that savings, they can build their own institutions. But you see, when you let other people determine your perception of your own leaders, you fall back to be victimized by those people. and fall back into your old habits, which of course lead to supporting them. And we have to understand then what this is about. This is why ultimately you see an African-centered education is not a mere teaching of African history and culture, but ultimately a reorganization of the African personality and a reorganization of African taste and interests such that Africans become self-supporting and self-sufficient and become a powerful people. So you have to be careful, you see. Black people are absolutists. Yeah, we're absolutists, you know. It doesn't matter whether you're Christian or Marxist or whatever religion or whatever you belong to. When it comes from other people, we hear something and we believe it because it's absolutely true. You see? Yeah, that's true. And you know, and we dedicate ourselves to it. That's irrefutable. Yeah, this will get you in trouble. You know, again, you Christians, Thomas says, Lord, I believe, but help thy mind what? Unbelief. Don't make me believe too much. You got to prove something to me. You just can't come back here and tell me that you got off the cross, man. Show me the God. Yeah, let me see something here. You see, we just can't take it on your what? Your word. But you see, the idea of the European is to get us to take him on his what? Word. And he handed us the word. Yeah. And he ended up, though, what did we say? With the land and everything else. Why? Because we believe the word only. Absolutely. Because the word to us appeared true. Now, let me quickly show you what I mean by this. A European walks up and says, we shouldn't really see each other in terms of race. We are all human, and the globe belongs to all of mankind. We shouldn't really relate to each other in terms of nationalities. We should be free to move across the earth as we see fit. And we should be free to invest wherever there are opportunities to invest. All of us should have that right. That's called free market. Yeah, free market economy. Oh yeah, that's right, that's right. And of course, we're glad to hear from him, you know. Oh, this man has become civilized at last. But wait a minute, you see, you gotta ask something. Even though you might not argue with the basic premise, you gotta ask, who is saying this? And why are they saying it? What will be the consequence of my believing this? You see, you gotta go beyond the absolute truth of something and look at it in the context of power and the context of differences. You see, you got a bunch of people right here telling you, well, we preach universal principles and we talk about universal truths. Then why isn't the bounty of the earth universally distributed? Why aren't the goods of the earth randomly distributed? Why is there a non-random distribution of power and benefits and so forth? And it seems to cluster around the very people who preach universal principles. And the people who believe it most have it least. Yeah. Because you see, that guy who's telling you that we all should be free to invest wherever opportunity lies is the only guy that has what? The money. then I will deliver. So God also does what? Serves. He's not only served, he what? Serves. But the Negro is only taught to what? Serve God. And therefore, we serve religions, but our religions do not serve us. Somebody told Elijah Muhammad, being a black Muslim makes you unorthodox. That's exactly the point. Because being black Muslim means that Islam will serve who? Black folks. There just won't be an instance of black folks serving what? Islam alone. But Islam, being black Islam, becomes an Islam that operates in the service of black folk and black interests. Hope you understand what I'm saying here. You understand? We have to recognize this, so we got to get over this absolutism. And the Marxists run the same game, scientific socialism. Same old nonsense. In what way does, you got to ask, in what way does my believing this serve me? And in what way do your preaching this and having me believe this serve you? And say, well, what you say is true, and I don't argue against it. I am not in agreement with the consequences. We must also change some other things in our relationship along with this belief, so that in my believing it, I will not be deprived of my freedom or deprived of my resources and of my possibilities. Share some of that doggone money if you believe it so hard. Oh, let me run. I know my time is going out here. We're going to run it through, ladies and gentlemen. We got another speech coming. But due to power differentials, the processes of latent behavior are tantamount to the processes of creation. It goes back to this. The application of certain rules and definitions to others influence how they are related to. When you put a label on somebody, you are also defining how other people, how that somebody is going to be related to by others. It's not a mere label. It is a prescription for relationships, how other people will relate to this individual. It is also a prescription for how this person will be perceived by others and how they relate to themselves and perceive themselves. In other words, then, the labeling of people affects their perception of themselves and of the world. And by being labeled, then, their vision is transformed. And to a degree, so is their psychology. And so is their relationship with other people. Thus, due to power differentials, the processes of labeling behavior are tantamount to the processes of creation. What am I saying here? The processes of letting Europeans label our behavior and apply their rules and definitions to our behavior is not a mere stigmatizing of our behavior, but it is tantamount to their creating our behavior. For today, ladies and gentlemen, we are a created people. We have been created by the European power system. We have yet to become self-creating. And we will become self-creating when we become self-labeling. And we become labelers of the world ourselves. When we measure our children and relate to them in terms of our measurement, not in terms of other people's measurement of them. Labeling and the prescriptions it implies may therefore become a part of the problem it is designed to solve. You thought it was going to solve your child's problem when they were taking the special ed? No. It becomes a part of the problem itself. It helps to maintain the problem. It is there to maintain the problem. I was going to do a definition of learning disabled, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this. The process of classifying a child as learning disabled typically begins when a teacher or parent or both becomes dissatisfied with the child's performance in school. And then the child may be tested or tests are recommended. Why are no tests? There are no tests of the teacher. Yeah. No test of the school. No test of the school system. No test of the political purpose and direction of the educational system itself. Why is it that it's the child who's the only thing tested in this equation, ladies and gentlemen? Who is the learning disabled child? According to the definition passed by public law, enshrined in public law 94-142, who is the disabled child leaves the specific procedures for classifying learning disabled children up to individual school districts and to states. And then you're going to have various definitions. Definitions that center around aptitude as they relate to the child's actual achievement, that is IQ and what he's really achieving. Some of them will look at the discrepancy, that is the discrepancy between aptitude and achievement. Others will base their learning disability estimation on the number of grades below grade level. Some will say 1 year, others will say 2. Others will look at special tests, maybe some perceptual motor tests and other kinds of tests, psycholinguistic tests, or they have just catalogs of tests. They may even measure the EEG and put them through the PET scans and EMRs and all the rest of that stuff. They have special ways of interpreting standardized tests. Look at the scores on the Stanford Binet or the other tests. All of these are ways in which the learning disabled child is supposedly discovered. According to a respected authority in this area, author of the book Learning Disabled, yes, Child, and by Sylvia Fernham Diggory, an alarming number of children are misclassified as learning disabled. By recent estimates, 80% of the children who are classified as learning disabled should not have been. We have a game going on here. Gerald Coles, in The Learning Mystique, a critical look at learning disability, contends that the rare, genuinely learning disabled children, perhaps 5 out of every 1,000 children, are often lost in the misclassified crowd and are not receiving the specialized education that they need and that the federal law mandates. I just want to mention here in closing, you got to recognize that there are any number of definitions. Despite the increasing number of students being declared eligible for learning disabled services and the intuitive appeal of this term, learning disabled, there's little agreement as to what it really is. In the Journal of Psychoeducational Assessment, a study by Vaughn and Hodges reported as many as 38 different definitions in a survey of 42 state departments of education as to what it means to be learning disabled. So what are we talking about here? They found considerable variation across states and districts. And of course, related to these variabilities in definitions and rules defining what is learned behavior is, of course, the variability in the number of students you're going to get defined as learning disabled. This is why I was talking earlier about rules and definitions, you see. In other words, what rule and definition you apply creates populations, you see. Because the rule then will enclose certain types of behavior. One rule will enclose it, whereas the other rule will not, you see. In a research sample including 48 school-identified LD students, learning disabled students, and 96 non-learning disabled students, Braun and Hodges determined how many were classifiable as LD, as learning disabled, according to 14 operational definitions. That is, out of these 38, we're going to take 14 of the definitions. And these are operational definitions, meaning that these definitions not only define what they perceive as learning disabled or behavior indicative of create, in a sense, the disability and define the population. So why do we just lay back when we let another people apply definitions and rules to our children? Is it because we believe psychology is some kind of exact science? Or is it because we simply believe that those who are engaged in this process are only performing psychological services, are only in there to serve educational purposes, when they don't even know what the hell they're talking about? Okay? For the learning disabled sample alone, 9 of the 14 definitions did not identify even half of the learning disabled students as learning disabled. Okay? So that's that. But in terms of time, we're going to have to move on. Let me skip over some things. Maybe on another thing we'll look at this. Let's quickly look at the political economy of special education. Has many economic implications. Once a child has been certified as learning disabled, additional money is sent to the school district on the child's behalf. The exact amount varies, but it's quite substantial. It is well now over $7,000 per child. You're talking about an industry as a result of defining our children as learning disabled that generates now well over $15 billion. The money is not sent directly to the individual children, but goes into a general budget to pay the special education personnel to buy supplies. So what do we have here, ladies and gentlemen? A built-in incentive to do what? Classify our children as learning disabled because it brings in money to the district. So it's no wonder then that between 1977 and 1986, the children classified as learning disabled moved from 800,000 to 2 million. You'll learn one day, ladies and gentlemen, that black problems and the image of black people as problem people is worth billions of dollars to Europeans. The Native American in the United States was not destroyed simply because they were surplus, you see. They were of little or no economic value to this country. And therefore, this country did not intend to feed what it called useless mouths. And therefore, it could better live without them. And there is no capitalist system that's going to carry on the burden of millions of people. It will see you dead before it will see itself dragged into the ground. That 40 black folk in second banana jobs implies great advancement for Negro people in America? What if we had black executives over all of the Fortune 500 companies? What does that mean within the context of 40 million black folk? But you see, we got a bunch of people here who want to make you think that their getting a job represents an advancement for the race. The greatest measure of advancement for the race is the movement of average people into jobs, not the movement of a small elite. But what is it doing for the average person? It is an insult in this system anyway that an 8th grade or 9th grade educated person can't get a good job. See, we accept this as written. The idea that if you got an 8th grade education, 9th grade education, you're supposed to starve to death. Where is that written in concrete? What kind of nation is it that will project this kind of mythology? That simply because you don't finish high school, or simply because you only finish high school, you're supposed to work for a poverty wage. But we've sort of bought into this concept and this idea. Now let's look quickly here then at the number of black folk who are making $50,000 and above. You know, that would include these great executives, right? You know what percentage of black people earn $50,000 and over? 50% of the black population. Only 15% of this 40 million people. 14 earn between $35,000 and $50,000, 14%. 14% earn between $25,000 and $35,000. 18 between $15,000 and $25,000. 11 between $10,000 and $15,000. And 15% between $5,000 and $9,000. In other words, 15% of the people are below the official poverty line, with 11% making under $5,000 a year. So we must look at progress in terms of where the average person, where these people between, let's say, 25,000 and below moving. And are those people moving? Not the small percentage that may be getting above $50,000 a year. Be very careful. J.C. Smith, an author, made the following statement: the most efficient way to maintain power is to give a little where it shows a lot. Thus, the system only removes some of the most obvious forms of exploitation and abuse. What are we talking about here? We're talking about tokenism. In other words, this nation can get a lot of mileage out of appointing 40 executives to positions, to high-profile positions in its industrial structure, and have black people then to see the appointment of these 40 people as representing progress for the whole race. This is what we mean by saying what? Give a little where it shows a lot. Okay, we'll give you a few positions, and they're high-profile positions, and therefore you're overwhelmed by people being in this position, and you're fed with the false hope then that these positions and all the other positions that we don't have are now open and available to us as a people. You must recognize in my last reading that there are something like 17 million businesses in America. And to have 40 executives or even 500 executives, black executives, or to have 5,000 black executives is almost an unmeasurable number in amongst 17 million businesses. And if at last count, if my memory serves me, there's something like 77,000 black businesses. So again, you can realize the tremendous economic gap between black folk and so-called white folk and other folk in this system. However, the appointing of these black executives in these high-profile positions helps to deceive us and helps us buy into the ideology of individualism. The idea is that these black executives are in these positions because they study hard at night, and because they came from the right families, and because their mothers supported them. Another kind of stupidity that we hear day in and day out. And therefore, we would not question the class structure of this system. We will not question the ethnic structure of the system. We will not structure the nature of power relations. We will not structure the intentions of Europeans to continue to maintain control over our lives. What the European has done essentially then is to blind us to the reality that their control over our lives and their control over the world is as strong, if not stronger, as it ever was, by appointing a few black people in high-profile positions, and to feed the rest of us with vain hopes that we one day will be among those few appointees, and to therefore deceive us into supporting the ideology of individualism, each one doing his own thing, that we do not have to operate as a race and as a collective group. And we do not have to operate on the basis of a common African identity, that we do not have to operate on the basis of a nation within a nation and as a people against other people, that all we have to do is pursue our own individual interests, and we will therefore make it. This is a major deception. It is very important that we face the reality of America today and face the reality of the world today. More so than that, it is very important that we face the reality of our own situation as African Americans. I've talked in other arenas about what I call the crisis of white supremacy. One of the reasons we don't worry too much as an African people, even when we're doing badly, and even when I'm talking the way I'm talking today, is it is very difficult for many African people to perceive the white man as not being in control of the world. Yeah. You know, we've seen so many movies where white boys win all the time. We've seen so many sitcoms where in 30 minutes a white boy figures out a way to save the day. We've seen so many white Supermen and Spider-Men and all these other kinds of men who are able to save Gotham from criminals and stuff, until we have been subliminally indoctrinated with the idea that white folk will always be on top. Many of us do not recognize that white folk will not always be on top and have not always been on top. That the white man on the so-called top has only been there for about 500 years out of the millions of years man has existed on this globe. And that the black man has been on top for thousands of years longer than the white man will ever know. But for people who don't know their own history, and for people who don't read history, for people who get their knowledge from cartoons and from sitcoms and from TV, you will never be aware of this. And so there are those among us, particularly those who live in America, who believe that since we live among the top white folk in the world, they will always stay on top and they will always hand us a crust of bread. There will always be welfare. And yet Clinton today is telling you that he's going to sweep you off of welfare after 2 years on it. And that one of the major programs that the Republicans are crying out for and other people are crying out for cutting are those welfare programs. If you look at some of the states across this country, such as California, Michigan, and other states, you will see welfare programs and other what we call government transfer programs, where money is transferred from the government to people in poverty. They have been declining over the past decade or so. Poor people are getting poorer in America, not better. As a matter of fact, we have as many, if not more now, poor people in America as we had in the early 1970s. Poverty has actually increased and is increasing to the point of where we initiated a war on poverty at the end in the middle 1960s. When you look at the number of African American children in poverty, the number of African American children who live in poverty today is the same as the number that lived in poverty in 1949. Okay? And this is what you have to measure sometimes, by the way, when you look at statistics, because some people want to say, well, you know, 2/3 of black folk are in the middle class, and 3/4 of white men above the poverty level in earnings. But that's not the most important measure of where we are as African people. What you have to look at in terms of where you are as an African people are the number of children who are in poverty. You see, what number of children live in poverty-stricken circumstances? And when you live in poverty-stricken circumstances, you are not just living in an area where there is an absence of money. You're living in an area where there are absences all about you. You generally then will live in areas where there is a high level of criminality, high levels of drug addiction, high levels of prostitution and other things going on, poor educational opportunities, poor job opportunities, poor health care, and other types of things. So when we say people are poor, we are not talking about people who just are lacking money. We're talking about people who are living under particular conditions that destroy the spirit, destroy the mind, destroy values, destroy outlooks, and continues to perpetuate poverty through the type of psychology that is ultimately inculcated in those people. And therefore, the more sensitive measure of the nature of where we are as a people are the number of our children who are living in poverty-stricken circumstances. So while we may talk about a third or two-thirds of our people living above the so-called poverty line, we must recognize that almost two-thirds of our children are living under poverty-stricken circumstances. And that does not augur well for the race. Simply because you have something does not mean that you will keep it. And this is another error that many Black people make. They think now because they got good jobs, or you think now because you may be living better, that this is going to continue. There's no universal law written in stone that because you're living well today, you're going to live better tomorrow. I frequently criticize this myth in America, this myth that we call the myth of progress, or the idea of progress, that is that things get better with time. So that even if they're not the way we want them today, they will be better tomorrow. Who told you that lie? They could be worse tomorrow. People don't only progress in history, they regress in history. Empires not only are built and grow up in histories, empires do what? Fall and collapse in histories. You must understand that. So simply because you may have a higher level of opportunity today, simply because you may have a higher income today, in no way guarantees greater opportunity tomorrow or higher income tomorrow. So there are those who will look at this so-called progress that African Americans have achieved today and will assume then that this expansion will continue in the future. And yet a reading of our own history would demonstrate that that is not the case. This is not the first time Black people voted. This is not the first time Black people have gone to so-called integrated school. This is not the first time in the history of African Americans that you had Black mayors, that you've had Black people sitting in the Congress of the United States, that you've had Black people sitting in the Senate of the United States, that you've had Black people head of corporations, are living in white neighborhoods. You know the time that this occurred in this country? This same type of lifestyle occurred in the United States over 100 years ago in the 1870s. Back in the 1870s, Black people were expecting to have a Black president, a vice president elected anytime. You had Black people in the 1870s proclaiming that the era of racism was over, that people would no longer be judged based on their race or background in the 1870s. But do you know what happened in the 1870s? Blacks were disenfranchised. The votes were taken away. Black people were thrown physically out of state legislatures. Black people were terrorized from the voting polls and were not allowed to vote. Black people who had been buried in graveyards beside white folks, they had their bodies dug up and shipped somewhere else. In other words, you see, because you are integrated doesn't mean you cannot become disintegrated. And it took them 100 years, up to the 1960s and 70s, for Black people to re-achieve again the things they had 100 years before. So there is no guarantee that because you have some kind of opportunities today, or because you're making some kind of progress today, that progress is guaranteed to you. Why were black people rejected and why were they disenfranchised? Because a group of white folk thought that it was in their interest that they be disenfranchised. And we are in exactly the same position today when there is a group of white folk in America today who come to believe seriously that it is in their interest to remove opportunities from black folk and to disenfranchise us, then it will happen. And ladies and gentlemen, it is on the verge of happening today. And we have to then keep this in mind. Why is this happening today? For one of the major reasons, it happened in the 1870s. Because in the 1870s, a part of the struggle also had to do with the economic nature of America. And America undergoing recession, and America undergoing depression, and America undergoing economic problems. And therefore, there was a need to readjust the racial status quo. And black people then were a part of that readjustment. We believe then, and this is what I was talking about earlier, we think then that whites will always be on top, and therefore their being on top is going to at least guarantee that we eat. That is a serious deception. I've talked before about the crisis of white supremacy. The fact now that there is a question as to whether whites will be the supreme race on this globe. There is beginning to be every likelihood that the Asian ethnic group will be the supreme ruling group on this globe, particularly if Africans are still listening to hip hop and still caught up in music and are still not caught up with the realities of what's going on. And I've often asked the question then, are we as African people struggling to gain our freedom from white domination only to fall under the domination of Asians? And that possibility is becoming more and more real today. There is no universal law that guarantees that white folks shall always win today, that they will always be on top. And therefore, African people should be aware of the fact that we can no longer depend upon white prosperity and depend upon white domination to provide us with second banana existences or existences at all. Now, if you read this year's The State of Black America, 1993, put out by the Urban League, and I urge people to read this particular publication, which is bulging with statistics. I think it will sober you up to a very great extent. But let's again look for a moment at the nature of the American economy in terms of jobs, since we are being educated to get jobs, aren't we? New York Times, February 28, 1993. Clinton plan confounds union chiefs. The headline reads, "Wanted, high-tech jobs for retrained workers." In other words, you're retraining workers for jobs, but what? Where are the jobs? And it starts by saying, what American workers need are a lot more high-wage, high-skilled, quality jobs, as President Clinton called them last week. Find those jobs and train people to do them, and the government, the schools, industry, and labor unions will build a prosperous middle class and the mighty American economy of the 21st century. We need an aggressive attempt to create high-tech jobs of the future, the president said. That was just a thematic salvo to the jobs plan that the administration will eventually put together. But the planners might have to do some heavy thinking about one dimension. Just what are those high-tech jobs? What are they? Where are they? Where are those jobs waiting for you simply because you got an education? They go in and ask other questions. What jobs are you going to train people for? This is America. These are the questions that America is asking itself. What kind of jobs are we going to train our people for? But this question is being asked in Germany. It's being asked in England. It's being asked in France. It's being asked across the European diaspora as well. It's being asked in Russia, in Eastern Europe. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, white American, European capitalism is in a state of crisis. And that means that African American people who are dependent upon the health of capitalism are also in a state of crisis. You've heard that phrase, when white folk get a cold, black folk get the flu. Well, you're going to really get the flu with this one. The other question is asked, does Ron Carey, president of the Teamsters Union, know? No. He says, I would not know how that comes about. Giant corporations, giant companies like General Motors, IBM, United Technologies, Boeing, Eastman Kodak, and Sears Roebuck are still shedding workers. Many of them high wage, highly skilled machinists, tool makers, and sheet metal workers, accountants, supervisors, and systems engineers. Does that sound like a great opportunity awaiting you simply because you're qualified? Within 1 week, Sears Roebuck and these other companies, with one week, announced 100,000 layoffs. There's a hoax around this idea that this country is in dire need of skilled workers. How can it be in dire need of skilled workers when it is laying off skilled workers by the thousands? And not only is it laying off skilled workers by the thousands, it is laying off skilled managerial workers by the thousands, middle management people. You see, those jobs that we as black folk used to talk about that set the glass ceiling beyond which we can't go, well, those jobs also now are being eliminated. The unemployment in the managerial areas is shrinking, not expanding. So then there's severe crisis. With GM and IBM boarding up factories, many of those jobs will never return. I tried to warn my people that America is going through a major restructuring in its economic system. We are not just suffering from some kind of recovery, after which it is over, we'll return to the jobs from which we were laid off. These jobs from which we are being laid off are never to come back again. You have now in this country a recovery that is occurring, but not creating new jobs. And this is a part of the problem. So you can now have an increase in business activity, yet that increase does not mean an increase in job opportunities. And what does that imply then? It implies either that more people are working overtime that are already there, but on a more ominous level, it implies that while people were being laid off, their jobs were being restructured or phased out and being replaced by computerized activities, or the nation's corporations are completely reorganizing themselves so that they will not need as many workers in the future. The companies in this country now are shipping jobs out of the country, period. They are deindustrializing this nation, which means that whole factories are being just taken wholesale out of this country and being planted in other nations across the world. Which means then that the good old factory jobs that used to pay well are no longer there. That is why black people are suffering in Detroit, suffering in the Midwest, suffering in the Northeast to a degree that they've never suffered before, because these areas used to be the chief industrial areas of this country. Now, these areas are being stripped of their industrial base, and the industries are being shipped out to other nations. And you got people now who are working for $4 a day on a job that we used to work for at $10, $20, and $30 an hour. And therefore, the corporations are no longer interested in hiring people who are demanding 15, 20, $30 an hour when they can take these jobs right down to Mexico and have the Mexicans and others work for $3, $4, $5 a day, ladies and gentlemen. This is the nature of what's going on in the world. They're no longer that interested either in developing computer technologists when they can hire a computer technologist in Ireland or in some other part of the world with their computer hooked directly into a main terminal in the United States so that information can be put directly into that computer outside of the country and communicated directly to computers here. Why then hire an American worker at $10, $15 an hour to run a computer when you can hire a computer operator overseas for the same price? You see, this communications revolution has drastically restructured the system. It means then that a computer operator in Ireland or some other part of the world can communicate as rapidly with you in America as you can communicate with someone downtown. As a matter of fact, when you call up now to get an airline reservation and so forth, you may be talking to someone in Jamaica or talking to someone in some other island somewhere and thinking that you're talking to them right here in the country. It has gotten to the point now where it is cheaper to employ people halfway around the world, ship the stuff back over here, than it is to make the stuff right here in America. I am in publishing. We send our books out to get printed. In actuality, it's cheaper now for us to send our books probably to Taiwan and have them printed there and shipped back to the United States than to have them printed in the country, say like in Michigan, and have a truck drive them to New York City. This is the kind of thing that's going on here. This is not just an ordinary recession. This is a major restructuring of the world. And if African people do not wake up and understand what is going on, we are going to be surplus people. And this country has a very clear record of what it does with surplus people. It does not feed them welfare. It does not give them handout. It kills them. Read the history of the Native American. The Native American in the United States was not destroyed simply because they were surplus, you see. They were of little or no economic value to this country. And therefore, this country did not intend to feed what it called useless mouths. And therefore, it could better live without them. And there is no capitalist system that's going to carry on the burden of millions of people. It will see you dead before it will see itself dragged into the ground. White folk are not going to see a decline in their power or decline in their dominance because they're taking care of black folk. I want you to make that very clear. If they have to make a choice between being number one in the world and top dog in the world and carrying a bunch of black folk on their back, there's no choice at all. The decision is already made in the question. They're going to rid themselves of you, like any other people in their right minds will do. So let's continue. You got to face that hard reality. It's only a brainwashed Negro that will sacrifice himself to other people. But and it goes on, but what many skilled workers are getting now are low-wage, low-skilled, lousy jobs. In the view of people at the union's executive council meeting here, the middle class that emerged in the bustling economy of the 50s and 60s is sliding into the ranks of the working poor. The skilled two-worker, two-job family with generous health and pension benefits is becoming the unskilled two-worker, 2, 3, and 4 part-time job family without benefits. And it goes on here. But let's look at the African situation right quickly, as depicted by the Urban League, as they look at the nature of what is happening in America. This article is titled African Americans in the 21st Century Labor Market. We're speaking now of the 21st century, Improving the Fit by Billy J. Tidwell. He writes here that the implications of these trends, the kind of trends that I've just mentioned, along with others, are at once promising and perilous. referring to African people. On one hand, the changing demography of the labor force may combine with the mountain centrality of human resources to expand opportunity for the group. What he's saying here is due to the fact that white folks and their population is not growing at such a high rate, and that in the 21st century there will be more non-whites in America than whites, that may mean an opportunity for black folks. Since they may have to hire those white folks to continue to run the country than they did in the past. But that is based on an assumption. And we've already talked about how this assumption can be knocked down. Simply because then there will be more black folk and more Latinos and so forth than white does not necessarily mean that the opportunity structure will open up for us. It may mean, as I mentioned earlier, that the country will simply ship in more immigrants, you see, to take the jobs. Or, we will ship out the jobs, you see, and just give the jobs to other ethnic groups in other nations and in other places. So you can't sit back and say, well, we're going to be the majority in the 21st century, and there are going to be more people of color in America than there will be white folks. So America would have to hire us because there ain't enough white folks to run the place. Yeah. Okay. We believe that it will. America is already demonstrating that it will move those jobs around and move those industries around in other places. Not only is it moving the industrial jobs around, it is moving the brain jobs around, the engineering jobs, the research jobs, the scientific jobs. This country now is beginning to get its major research and developmental work being done by Indians in India, by people in Malaysia, because these people produce a much higher level of engineers and others than even American whites are producing, and particularly American blacks are producing. Many major American corporations now are beginning to ship even their headquarters into other countries. Okay, so not even the major headquarters will be located in the United States. So there are tremendous changes going on, and these changes point to great dangers. He goes on to say, on the other hand, as intimated, the contemporary labor market is much different from that which existed during the heyday of industrialism, when one's pursuit of economic well-being was well served by physical muscle. In the new era, intellectual muscle, that is, the ability to think analytically, compute, comprehend instructions, make decisions, communicate clearly, interact effectively in group endeavor, is the ticket to prosperity. In this connection, there continues to be an unsettling lack of conversion, that is, of a coming together between where black folk are and where we need to be, in a bad fit between the overall conditions of African Americans and the human capital that the changing economy needs. In other words, we're not in the right place. One writer has made this point in stark, poignant terms. Black Americans have outlived their usefulness. Their raison d'etre, that is their usefulness, their reason for being, to this society has ceased to be a compelling issue. Once an economic asset, they are now considered an economic drag. The wood is all hewn, the water all drawn, the cotton all picked, and the rails reach from coast to coast. The ditches are all dug and the dishes are all put away, and only a few shoes remain to be shined. Okay, so people are very clear about where we are. He goes on to say, at the same time, the analysis leaves no doubt that African Americans must be much more astute and proactive on behalf of their own development and participation in the economic mainstream. Jacob, who heads the Urban Leagues, made this statement: African American children must be trained to see and seize opportunity in the chaos of the changing domestic marketplace. We must develop a new mindset. In the light of time, I won't go through some of the other things they indicate here to point to the nature of what is going on in this economy. I just want to read just a couple of other things because I really want you to seriously look at look at this situation here. What does the industrial restructuring portend for African Americans in the future? The prospects are less than sanguine. I mean, less than disturbed. They're quite disturbing. African Americans continue to be greatly dependent on the manufacturing sector, accounting for more than 10% of all manufacturing workers in 1991. Hence, there is a bad fit between the current distribution of the African American workforce and the reconfiguring industrial base. In other words, African Americans, in terms of where we are in the labor force today, we are in the very areas that will be strength to a great degree tomorrow. We are all almost sitting in the wrong position to take advantage of the nature of the restructuring of this economy. We're sitting in the kind of jobs and being trained for the kind of jobs that essentially will not exist, or a very few of which will exist in the future. In any event, the restructuring of the economy's industrial base has brought disproportionate hardship to the African American workforce. Under present conditions, there is little reason to expect this circumstance to improve. The parallel pattern of occupational changes could have even more ominous implications for our people. So here we are in a very serious pass as a people. We'll just quote you one more. After looking at the kinds of jobs that are projected to be more plentiful between the years 1990 and the year 2005. Again, the fit is not very good. Talking about our people again, African Americans are greatly underrepresented in the fastest growing occupations and overrepresented by those having the slowest projected growth. For example, in 1991, African Americans accounted for just 9% of the employed workforce in the front running technical and related support occupations, which are expanding at a 37% rate. By contrast, the African American share of the shrinking operators, fabricators, and laborers group has nearly 4 times the minimum 4% growth rate for these occupations. And so again, we in the wrong place at the wrong time. In short, the shifting occupational structure does not bode well for the economic future of African Americans. Both their current placement in the labor market and their relative position on the hierarchy of educational attainment are major constraints. Relieving these constraints, that is, improving the fit, is essential to the overall economic well-being of the African American community in the years ahead. But the challenge may be more complicated than that. And so we are facing the possibility that even this may not change our situation as a people. So what is the function of education? Is the function of education to get you jobs that don't exist? Or is the function of education a bit more deep than mere job training? Is it a bit more deep than operating on the assumption that the economy will just continue to expand and that there are jobs out there waiting for the educated and the highly skilled, and all you got to do is reach out and the apple will just drop in your hand? What is education about? You see, the major function of education, of course, is something that all groups of people have recognized, and groups of people who saw themselves as people and saw themselves as nations. And that is the basic function of education, is to secure the survival of a people, to maintain their very biological existence, and to enhance their quality of life. Education is not just about an individualistic preparation of some people for jobs. Ultimately, it must be the preparation of the people as a whole to maintain their existence, of which maintaining jobs and employment is a part of this major need, but it does not define it totally. You see, when you see the United States in its struggle against the Japanese and how they will maintain their supremacy in the world, how they will maintain their economic position in the world relative to the Japanese, you see them examining the nature of American education. They're not examining the nature of African American education as much as they're examining the nature of white folks' education, because they see that the education of their children and of themselves is crucial to their very survival, and that it is not merely designed to get one or two people a job, but ultimately it's designed to maintain the very life of the group itself. We as African people then must measure our education and how good our education is or how bad it is in terms of the degree to which it contributes to us maintaining our very biological existence, and to the degree to which our educated people contribute to enhancing the quality of life of ourselves as a people, not whether one or two Negroes struggle to the top and then try to project themselves as some kind of role models for the rest. You can make it if you only try. Ultimately, then, African people must take responsibility for their own education and must define education in terms of our own interests as a people. Education, by the very role it plays in the life of a people, must then, in the life of African people, be an African-centered education. The Japanese are not being educated for black folk. The white folk are not being educated for black folk. There's no group of people on this earth being educated to see to the interests of black folk. There's no people who are in their right mind being educated to see to the interests of other people and to serve the needs of other people. Folk who know that they are folks and people who know that they're people who know what their identity is, are operating in their own interests. And it will continue to be that way. And people who are on top in the world, people who are in control of their economic and political circumstances, people who are major players in the world, are people who take responsibility for their own education and for the education of their own children. You do not see any group of people who are on top in the world, any group of people who are creating a life for themselves, placing the education of their children in the hands of someone else. The Native American in the United States was not destroyed simply because they were surplus, you see. They were of little or no economic value to this country. And therefore, this country did not intend to feed what it called useless mouths. And therefore, it could better live without them. And there is no capitalist system that's going to carry on the burden of millions of people. It will see dead before it will see itself dragged into the ground.
woke up in a wilderness today, a place my mind could not remember, but my soul already knew. No longer searching for a steady breeze. There is soil on my skin and salt water in my blood. A descendant of God, I feel as if I am sunshine with a pulse. I bear my fertile flower from which humanity originates. Rivers of milk flow from me, and I watch as entire kingdoms bow. All the children are here, barefoot in the morning, and the dirt is rich with many treasures. Vamos a la playa. You are free to transcend. You are free to be creature, and you are free to bend.
Are a reservoir of great wealth, and certainly nobody can energize us like this brother. And as we greet him tonight, we just want to give him a round welcome applause and let him know how much we love him as a brother who has stayed true to the course. That's Dr. Amos Wilson. Let's give it up for Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you kindly. Thank you. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. It's great to be back here with you again this evening. It's been a while, and I always appreciate coming and being with you. And, of course, appreciate your support. And I know each time I've been here, I've promised you about our next publication, but it's definitely on the way. We are definitely now expecting to be out in November. And, of course, each time I talk with you, the book gets larger. At last count, Brother Sababu, my co-partner there, told me we were around about 800 pages. So we're going to try to split it up for you, maybe 4 and 4. Give you some good wintertime reading. But then in a way, it's when we recognize that we are as complicated as any other people. And one of the things sometimes we underestimate the degree to which we must address ourselves as a people. And too often we have people who think that our issues and the things that we have to deal with can be described in 25 words or less. And so there are people who think that we are small people and small-minded people, so they don't have to write sometimes some sizable material. If other nations and other people require libraries to deal with their issues, so do we.
Work for temp agencies, the fastest growing business in the country. High-tech temp agencies. And we're not talking about secretaries and so forth. We're talking about people with full degrees in accounting, computer science, and many other areas will be temporarily hired, but rarely taken on permanently by the companies. There are drastic changes going on here. Workers are being leased to other companies, yes. Yeah. So you literally belong to the temp agency and they'll lease you to work for another company. Re-engineering and changing of the work area is expected to eliminate 25 million jobs in this country. So the most, yes, out of a 95 million job workforce, we're facing very drastic changes here. This is not any time for us to be playing. And yet I see our people are literally like lambs going to slaughter, completely innocent and unknowing of what is coming and what is occurring right now. still singing and bobbing their heads to this rock music, and grown men throwing balls at hoops and stuff like this and playing boys' games. Yes. Seriously not knowing what's going on in the world. And the other world sits right in your face and like, but you should read the material. When people talk about the possibilities, they talk about the idea. Will Africa survive? You know, they write it off. And it's right in there. It's not hidden. But you know what the phrase is. If you want to hide something from a Negro, what do? Put it in writing. Put it in writing. Just put it right in writing. So, see, this is why you don't teach black children to read and you don't motivate black people to be interested in reading. Because I tell you, the academic problem that our people have in the schools are not academic, they're political. They just show up in the school. If we were a real reading people, if we had powerful vocabularies, this country would practice overt censorship in its published material. But it can literally publish anything and everything because it can depend on us not to read and not to be interested. And not only publish it, it can put things right in front of our faces, like the Star Wars movies. Right there, where it showed as these producers and directors demonstrated in that movie that when whites think of the future, they do not see black folk in it. They have robots running ships. They have these created monstrosities like Chewbacca, you know, that's probably the result of gene splicing and this kind of stuff. All kinds of creations, the result of molecular biology and recombinant research, but not a black person in there. Not a black person in there. And when you read science fiction, and when you read projections into the future, we're not included there. No, sir. As a people. Education is not going to be enough to save you. Now, it's more serious than that. See, we get into this, get that education. And I'm not saying not to, don't get me wrong. But it's going to take more than that. You know, finding the employment of its own children. A recent reading about the employment prospects of scientists in the United States indicates that among new PhDs in the natural sciences, including computer science, but physics and so forth, among these new PhDs coming out of places like MIT, Stanford, and so forth, we are now suffering a 13% unemployment rate. Yeah. This used to be a situation where the companies used to sit up around graduation time and literally hand these people jobs. Right. They're not there. They used to get almost automatic faculty positions. These positions are no longer readily available because the universities are hiring the Russians, indicating that they have the right to hire the very best. So where does that leave us as a people? As a matter of fact, this country now is suffering a surplus of college graduates. Do not use this not to go, okay? I don't want you to misinterpret it, because the idea is not to get educated. The idea is to do something with it, to do something different with it, okay? If we are to gain power in this country and in the world, we must tremendously increase the number of college graduates, okay? But we're going to have to do this within another context, in the context other than the idea that we are going to college to get a job, to be hired by someone else. It will have to be done in the context that we will be self-employing. Yes, we have to face the realities that confront us.
Yes, sir.
You know, I'll let the others pump your egos up. I'll bring the bad news. Okay. You see, while we need our esteem built up, we also need to be real.
Yes, sir.
We need to know what's going on in reality. We're being then hemmed in by the development of Europe and the so-called uniting of Europe, the United States itself developing a free market system with Canada and with Mexico, and the Asians developing, the Latin Americans. What is going on with African people? I want you to get out of this nonsense called multiculturalism.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. There are people pumping us now with that stuff. We just diversity in the workplace. You know, all that kind of jazz. And so we get these kind of philosophies and ideologies whenever Black people began to approach an African consciousness and began to operate on the basis of an African identity. All of a sudden, everybody wants us to become multicultural. Let everybody hone in on our stuff.
Right.
You see. But when you look around the world, other people are operating in terms of their ethnicity.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Right.
I was reviewing the operation of the Koreans in New York City as a part of my upcoming book on power. Working on the last chapter now, dealing with power. And of course, I keep files, and it's so good to keep files and keep files of current events, because you can see movements occurring that you don't see otherwise. Looked up March 22nd, the Koreans indicated in the New York Times that now today it's pretty much stabilized their retail system.
Yes, sir.
They pretty much stabilized their economic base in America. They are now moving to operate politically in this country. And they laid out their demands in the New York Times on the 22nd of March. Right in your face.
Yes, sir.
Right there. What did they say? We want three things, and we want every mayoral candidate to come by and talk to us about these three things as a group. I looked at their groups, the Korean Producers Association, not the Multicultural Producers Association. Okay? You know, but what? The Korean Producers Association. Started in, where I believe 85 or somewhere back there, with about 25 members. Now they got more than 1,000 or more. I saw the Korean Grocers Association. Not the multicultural, not the Korean African American, not the Korean We Love All People Association. We are one from New York to California Association. The Korean Grocers Association. Okay? And I'm saying this because, you see, we're getting all this multicultural nonsense while groups are operating in terms of ethnicity.
Right.
And we get it most intensely when people are operating on the basis of ethnicity. Over 2,000 or 3,000 members belong to this group. The Grocers Association. The Korean Centers for Small Business. Not Multicultural Center for Small Business, but the Korean Center for Small Business. What is its purpose? To take the new immigrant, the Korean would-be business person, from one step all the way to the end in establishing a business. Yeah. So they can be guided as to how to set up a business. I'm going to come back to this because, see, this is the part of African-centered education. African-centered education is more than African history and culture. You see, we've let people shape the public debate and base the validity of African-centeredness on whether we taught the Greeks. Okay? I'm going to be upfront with you. I don't give a hoot whether we taught the Greeks or any other bunch of white men. I don't get any thrill out of having taught any Greeks. What great pride is there to be gotten out of teaching Europeans who circle back on you and put you in slavery? How can your self-esteem and who you are rest on that kind of thing? And then we commit a whole lot of energy struggling with these whiteys as to whether we taught them or not. Screw you. It doesn't matter. You must recognize one thing about African-centeredness. One of the major points of African-centeredness is this, that the white man is no longer the final word. We need to explain ourselves to him or establish proofs to his satisfaction. If you are to remove yourself from domination, then you must remove the fact that someone else other than yourself has the last word. Yes. And that's what this struggle is about, you know. Whites still want to be in position of deciding truth or falsehood. So you got to explain to our satisfaction and according to our scholastic criteria and all of that, whether, you know, no, we don't have to do that at all. In fact, we're moving away from that. You can only dominate someone if you have the last word, right? If you have the final word. Yeah, that's a number one of importance to domination. So you cannot get out from the domination of other people if you continue to let them be the final validators of truth. You must validate truth within your own context. I wish I had time to talk about some other things here. You know, truth and mythology. There's so much. I see how people out there struggling to try to explain to these white boys, you know, what's going on. African-centeredness covers every aspect of life. Every area of life is covered by African-centeredness. Not just African history and culture, but every part of it. That's why I ask people today, what is the economic program of multiculturalism for African people? What is contained in it? Where is the economics in there? For it? Is there an economic plan for African people in multiculturalism? Is there a plan for reducing so-called black-on-black violence? Where in multiculturalism is there a plan for resolving the family issues in the black community, high levels of teenage pregnancy and disrupted families and the other kinds of things? Where is the plan for a Pan-African economic system in multiculturalism? Where's the plan for changing the power relationships between Africans in America and Africans in the world and all other people in America and in the world? Well, what is this then? Some kind of little Pollyanna joke where people sing and dance each other little music and feel good about each other and tell each other little lies about how each one has contributed to America, you know, and how wonderful we all are. You know, so in the meanwhile, what happens? The Koreans are still building their system. The Arabs are still building their system. The Chinese are still building their system. The Europeans are still building their system. And Negroes are singing other people's songs. Why? Because we want to be loved depended on. Isn't that how that song goes? Yeah. We are concerned with social progress, not economic progress, not political progress, not the changes in power relations, but how people treat us.
Yes, sir.
Civility.
Yes, sir.
You know, so if other people are nice to us and smile when they take our money, we're happy. There's an organization called the Korean Association of Greater New York, the umbrella organization of the other associations. It's the human relations arm, mainly designed to deal with Negroes and other people, but mostly Negroes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How do they deal with other Negroes? They heard that we were complaining about how uncivil the Koreans were treating us in these stores. They didn't smile enough for our liking. They didn't say thank you well enough, you know. And the Koreans said, well, you know, this is a cultural trait we have, you know, that's just our nature. But, you know, they created so much tension because we were complaining not about the fact that they own a great part of our economic infrastructure, but because they weren't nice to us. So what did they decide to do? Now they're training their merchants to be nice to black folks. They run special seminars in etiquette for black folks. Yeah. They even hired a black professional to go around and study their behavior in relationship to black folk so that their behavior could be improved. Because they know that a Negro would give up anything if you're nice to them. As long as you're not another Negro. You know? And if a foreigner smiles at them and, you know, is nice to them and makes them forget that they are black, they'll give everything up. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So they help because they study our psychology. And every time they abuse us in the stores, our old jacklegs run down there talking about unity and talking about how, you know, we can get along. You see, not about how to change the situation. And so we've taught them, look, be nice. You know, hire a few of our people and put them on a ladder and let them look down and watch each other, you know. Something like that. This is the game. Now they're handing out turkeys at Christmas time to Negroes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, very cheap. Very cheaply. Because, you know, we need love. Our egos have been so damaged until the only thing we can think about is love. That's the only thing we are obsessed by, love. Stroke. Ego boosting. To the exclusion of almost everything else. We're caught up in feelings. Make me feel good. Rock me all night long. You know how it is. You know. And that's it. Yeah. That's what it's about. Yeah. And that's understandable given our history, but we got to break out of it. It has a psychological basis to it, but we got to break out of it, you see. It comes from being abused. It comes from having our ego so damaged, you see. And we'll get back to that in a minute, hopefully. But we have become obsessed by human relations rather than power relations.
Yes, sir.
You see? And other people are aware of that. And they use the human relations in order to gain power over us. Yeah. So they hand out the turkeys. They give leftover produce to black senior citizens places now. Clothes that has not been claimed, they're handing that out now in some parts of the black community. But it's more sophisticated than that. Now they're handing out scholarships. $1,000 scholarship, $2,000 scholarship to black folk. They've even sucked in some of our leaders. They had old Al Sharpton down there giving the invocation at one of their major things there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you got to deal with it, man. And then I heard old Percy Sutton over here the other day talking about unity on LIB as they were handing out these little $2,000 tuition scholarships to a few black folks. Of the millions of dollars that this community is taking out of the black community, and you can't out pay a semester's tuition with $2,000. Understand? But we just bought for pennies and nickels. Just, I'm telling you, there's a psychology, I call it. I won't use it here, but we're just, yes, sir. I'm telling you, it's an amazing thing to watch. Yeah, it's amazing. Now they're sending, 20 black and Latinos, I think, to Seoul, Korea, to a university there every year. For the next 5 years, they're going to send 20 of them over there to be educated. Yeah. You understand what is going on here? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Now they're telling the mayoral candidates that we want a Korean cooperative in New York City. Yes, sir. So that we won't have to buy our produce and other things through the Bronx Terminal Market. Mm-hmm. We want our own produce and grocery wholesale depot. So we won't even have to give the white folk any money. And now we got it on both ends. We're going to have the wholesale end and what? The retail end. And in this way, we're going to control what? Prices and control the market. So that any other people and other people entering into the market are going to have to deal with us on both ends of the spectrum. And you're not going to get the advantages that you had before. This is what goes on. This is what happens when people think in terms of ethnicity and operate in terms of ethnicity. And then talk to other people about multiculturalism. You see.
And the interesting thing about the upcoming book is that with that 800 pages, it's basically a survey looking at various areas of life. If you recall, we've titled it Blueprint. And we are essentially then trying to lay out a blueprint, a prescriptive book. Now we are coming into more and more into prescriptive type of writing, laying out very practical kinds of steps and very practical methods for achieving what it is we must achieve as African people. This means we have to cover a lot of territory. We are covering psychology, we are covering, of course, history, sociology, a great deal of political science, a great deal of economics and related fields, anthropology and so forth, because all of these have to be combined in the process of nation building. And this is what we really have to be about, is the process of building a nation as a people. If you're not thinking in terms of nationhood, then I must say, frankly, you're not thinking seriously of being liberated. All right. Trying to integrate and merge with our enemies is not going to solve our problem. And it's not going to happen, as a matter of fact. It is a fantasy that has kept us from taking care of business for far too long. The idea that we're going to one day be one with these people. That we're going to merge into invisibility with these white folks. And even if that were possible, we should question our motives for wanting to do so. You know, why would you want to merge with the world's greatest criminals and thieves? With the people who have the worst values the world has ever known? who are taking the food out of other people's mouths. You see? But here you have the people who rob you and take everything you got and then say, you don't have enough to support yourself. You know? This is the kind of joke that we got going at here. And we're going to come back to this issue of values. But we're going to talk a little bit about African-centered consciousness, personality, and culture as instruments of power. Because ultimately, this is what this whole struggle is about. Power. Not loving one another and all those things we hear. Power. And to a great extent, the problems that we are confronted with today as African people in America flows from our powerlessness or our inappropriate use of power. We've been made to even talk about it. We've been made to think that power is sinful and that to pursue it is a sinful pursuit. And that it's wrong. But you cannot exist without power. Without power, there is no life. A battery without power is dead. You need power to act, to behave in the world, to deal with the world. And consequently, then, we must interpret what we are about in terms of power. And we have the power, ladies and gentlemen. We have the possibilities. We just need to reorganize ourselves, reorganize our consciousness and our personality and our culture, and see them as instruments of power and use them as instruments of power to transform our situation. So we should not look at consciousness as some abstraction. As I often tell people, the most practical thing you can have is a good theory, is a good concept to guide your behavior, to be used as an instrument to measure reality, as an instrument to test reality. A good theory then organizes the world and organizes one's approach to the world. It permits one to be able to evaluate the world in terms of where one wants to go and in terms of what one wants to do. To be without theory then is to approach the world on an ad hoc basis, you know, just to meet it here and there and to not approach it in a systematic form. To live reactionarily, always reacting to what other people are doing, always being overwhelmed by events and overwhelmed by the future, instead of creating events and creating the future and making the future. See, when one has then a good theory and a good concept, one is able to do that. Consciousness, without human consciousness, there is no world. It is the presence of human consciousness that brings meaning into the world. Without human beings in this world, conscious human beings in this world, in effect, there would not be a world. We bring the world into being through our consciousness. And through our consciousness, we create the world we live in. Out of the totality of reality, our consciousness cuts out a world that befits itself. In other words, the kind of world you exist in reflects the kind of consciousness that you have. And notice if you change your consciousness or change your values and orientation, you enter into a different world. You interact with different people. People often that you didn't even know existed in the world. Social situations that you might not have even recognized until you entered into a new level of consciousness. You see people, say, for instance, who become addicted, say, to crack or something, and now enter into a whole world and enter into a whole social system that before they became addicted, they hardly noticed. They didn't know what it was all about. And they picked up new friends and new relations, whole new ways of acting, whole new purposes in life. They lost old friends, broke with old families, and all kinds of things. In other words, the consciousness, that addictive consciousness, brought into the world a new foreground and put other things into the background. Therefore, man's consciousness is a creative act. And the kind of consciousness you have will determine the kind of world you create. And consequently, when you look at the world that we live in, African people, we must recognize to a great extent, it is a world of our own creation. It is a world that has been generated by the type of consciousness we've been permitted to be instilled in us as a people. As I told you earlier today on the radio, we talk about the white man as having power. And I want you to recognize that power ultimately has to do with a relationship between people. And that the white man's so-called power is to a great extent based upon the nature of the relationship he has with the black man. We empower him by the nature of our own behavior and attitudes as a people. He cannot be, as I said earlier, what he is unless we are what we are. I'm telling you. To a good extent, the European is our creation. Yes. Mm-hmm. If we look at our behavior, we will see that to a good extent it is our behavior, our values, our consciousness, the kind of personalities we've established in ourselves, our tastes, our desires and needs that maintains the European in this position. We talk about the civil rights movement and the apartheid system of the South. When blacks decided just to get out of the buses and walk, the system changed. Yeah. When they just stopped sitting behind the white driver, just changing that relationship, changed the nature of power in that system. When they decided then to walk side by side, when they decided to walk abreast and line themselves up, because they had not walked that way before, for the ends before, the relationship changed. When they kept their monies in their pockets, when they sat on those stools and blocked the other people from them, and changed the nature of the interactions between themselves and Europeans, the nature of the system changed. So therefore we have tremendous power. It depends upon how we align ourselves as a people and how we decide to relate to other people in the world, because they cannot have what they have unless we are who we are. And that is why we don't have to spend a great deal of time always appealing to them and analyzing them, because we can better appeal to our own sense of self and our own consciousness. And we waste a lot of time trying to transform them, when through transforming ourselves, they will be transformed automatically. The power is in our hands. We are not destined to be the servants of white folk. That is not the destiny of black folk. No way. And we have to change this idea, because many of us are still operating on that concept. As I said this morning, many of us go to these schools to become what? Qualified. To work for whom? For them. Why do we assume that they're going to have the jobs for us? Yes. These people are having difficulty making jobs for themselves. The greatest problems that the Europeans are facing today, and the European economies are facing today, is that they are not generating enough jobs for their own people. And even though America is bragging about the millions of jobs it's creating, those jobs are part-time jobs. The bulk of them are part-time jobs, low-wage jobs, and jobs that have little or no future. So when people talk about creating jobs, you got to ask what kind of jobs are being created. That is why, of course, this system is not investing in black education. It no longer needs black people to maintain its employment structure. You see it bringing in people from outside of the nation to be employed. You see it even is hiring in the world itself, in other nations and other places. Already, it has reached the point where its need for black males is pretty much saturated. And it literally then is warehousing us in the jails and prisons and provoking us to kill each other and to destroy each other out here in these streets. And yet, we are still organizing the education of our children as if the white man still has jobs waiting for them in multitudes. How different our education would be if we sent our children to school to create jobs for themselves. To create their own economic and political systems, to see themselves as the major sources of their employment. As I remarked earlier today while we were in the radio station, I heard something about some people out here protesting for jobs and pushing these other people for jobs. And I asked the question, do we know how many jobs we really create for other people? We are a job creating people. We don't realize it because we don't think in terms of nation. You see, if we saw ourselves as a nation, we could see that we create jobs like any other nation. I mentioned that today. How many jobs are created by black music? Yeah, look at the whole structure of the music industry. From promoters to manufacturers of the records and the tapes and what have you, to the whole entertainment field, to the sellers of music in the stores, you know what we say, the Tower Records and the other great sellers of records and music and so forth, advertising that uses our music and all these things. How many thousands of jobs are we creating as people? We're creating them, but they have them. You see? We sing the music, they sell it. We sing the music, they market it. We sing the music, they promote it. You see? We sing the music, they produce great conglomerates like Sony, CBS Music, creating all kinds of jobs. We're creating tremendous jobs for a lot of people. How many jobs do we create just buying from Koreans? Buying from other ethnic groups out here? How many people are we creating employment for in terms of our spending habits as a people and our consumption habits as a people? How many jobs are we creating going to jail? We're creating all kinds of jobs and wealth. And we must come to understand this. We are creating these jobs, and yet we are begging for jobs. This means that in somewhere our consciousness has been impaired. We are begging for what we are making already. And we cannot use our own creations as a source of our own wealth. I told you earlier today that the Creator could not have intended for us as African people to be a poor people if the Creator implanted in our soils all the wealth that was planted there. We talk about the minerals and the oil and the gold and the this and the that that's implanted in African soil. So it seems as if the Creator blessed us from the very beginning with wealth and possibility. Therefore, for us to be going hungry over this wealth and to be starving in the midst of it and to be perceived as a dependent, indebted people while our wealth is being shipped out to other people. We're actually selling a lot of it for pennies and nickels and dimes and less. Means that there is something wrong with our consciousness. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we've said what? That the wealth of a people is ultimately not in their land. But where is it? It's in the mind. The wealth of man is in his mind. Because ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we've said what? That the wealth of a people is ultimately not in their land. But where is it? It's in the mind. The wealth of man is in his mind, in his consciousness. You got to look at it. And we mentioned the example of Japan. No mineral wealth to speak of whatsoever. Nothing at all. A nation, by the way, which is totally dependent. Of course, we get things backwards, don't we? We see ourselves as depending on Europeans when the reality is the other way around. When they depend on us and our souls and our people, we have to be backwards in order for this situation to be the way it is. Our reality has to be turned backwards, and we have to live in an almost permanent state of deception in order to be used the way we are used. The Japanese must depend on others for their vital resources, their oil, their timber, all of these things that they use to create their technology and so forth is taken from the soils of other people and then sold back to them. And yet they are seen as rich and powerful. And the people whose wealth they take or buy are seen as poor and poverty-stricken. Ultimately, then, you cannot rob or take from wealth from a what? Poor people. You cannot get wealth from a poverty-stricken people who have nothing you can get nothing from. So if you're getting all your diamonds and your gold and your magnesium and all this other stuff, then from African people, then African people must be what? Wealthy and rich. And therefore, if African people are poverty-stricken with this material wealth, then it must be because our consciousness as a people is impoverished. And we are suffering then an impoverishment of our mentality. As we said before, if you have a good mind, you can con another joker out of his land. You can con him out of his diamond and his gold. And this is what the other people have done. They have used their mind and their cleverness and taken from us what they did not have originally. And therefore, consciousness is not an abstract concept. It is not a theoretical concept. It is a concept that is directly related to the reality that one lives in and to the reality that one experiences. It is directly related to the type of life that one will live and does live. So I'm going to look at this for a minute. Particularly the consciousness of Africans in America. I'm often somewhat amused and taken aback by the number of people in this society who claim that slavery occurred somewhere back there. And you got some so-called black conservatives who claim that slavery no longer influences the nature of African people. I wonder what those people have to conserve in the first place. Are they conserving power? They're conserving wealth? What does a black conservative conserve? You know, you got to conserve something. And since they have very little, if anything, they must only be conserving the system that has created their poverty to begin with. And you see them ultimately justifying the poverty of African people and justifying the political and social and economic subordination of African people in the name of some kind of higher principles. So slavery is not supposed, the experience of slavery is not supposed to be operating in the mentality of black folk. You hear a lot of our youngsters will say that as well. How do you talk about slavery? That was back there. Or you know, whites talk about it. Well, you know, that was back there. We don't have anything to do with that anymore. You see. And it's an amazing situation because you have to remind them that you're still living off the interest of the wealth that your forefathers earned from slavery. You're still enjoying the accumulated wealth that began with the enslavement of our people. And if you're going to enjoy the wealth that was generated by evil, then you must take the curse that comes along with it.
Clean in the whip, fly girl lean on scene in the bed. Team full of queens, little gleam on the wrist. Feed up her jeans, shorty mean in the hips. She seen if it's lit, let her beam, let her twist. Wine to remind and she twerk to resist. Working and worship the earth in a dip. Stolen from Africa, seeking a gift. 16 on a ship.
All this time. I'm about to start this live over, y'all. We're gonna start this live over. Okay? I know y'all been waiting, and I always do this with this stupid music. We're gonna do it again. Give me 5 minutes. All right, y'all. I am so sorry. Blessings, blessings, blessings. We starting this live again because I was just going in again. I be going in and then the shit be on mute. I'm gonna just keep my thing off of mute forever. Okay? So we load up onto this page, y'all. If y'all was watching, I do apologize. All right, so this live is about inappropriate behavior. This is gonna be dedicated to my male. And this is, I want to start off by saying, no disrespect to my males, this don't apply to you. These this don't apply to you. Don't take offense because it's not for you. You're gonna